The sun had already dipped below the horizon when Lieutenant Colonel Diane Crawford finally left the base. It had been one of those days that seemed to stretch on forever, filled with briefings, paperwork, and the kind of decisions that weighed heavy on a person's shoulders. At 43 years old, she had spent more than 2 decades serving her country in ways that most people would never know about. Her unit was the kind that didn't make the evening news. The missions she led were the ones that got erased from official records. And that was exactly how she preferred it. Tonight, all she wanted was to get home, pour herself a glass of wine, and maybe watch something mindless on television. She was driving her old Honda Accord, a car she had owned for nearly 8 years now. Some of the younger soldiers at the base had joked with her about it once, asking why someone of her rank was still driving around in a car that had seen better days. She had just smiled and told them that the car still ran fine, and she wasn't the type to waste money on things she didn't need. What she didn't tell them was that she liked the anonymity of it. In her line of work, blending in was a skill that had saved her life. More times than she could count, the road that led away from Fort Bragg was quiet at this hour. Most of the traffic had cleared out, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. Diane had the radio on low, some old song from the 90s playing softly through the speakers. Her mind was elsewhere, going over the details of an upcoming operation that had been keeping her up at night. There were a lot of moving pieces, a lot of things that could go wrong. But that was the nature of the job. You planned for every possibility. And then you adapted when reality threw something unexpected at you. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought the patrol car was going to pass her, maybe responding to some emergency up ahead. But then it stayed right behind her, the red and blue lights strobing in the darkness. Diane checked her speedometer out of habit. She was doing exactly the speed limit, maybe even a mile or two under. She hadn't made any illegal turns, hadn't run any stop signs. There was no reason for this stop that she could think of. Still, she wasn't the type to get worked up over small inconveniences. She signaled, pulled over to the side of the road, and put the car in park. Then she rolled down her window, placed her hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen, and waited. These were habits that had been drilled into her over the years, not just from military training but from growing up as a black woman in America. Her father had taught her these things when she was just a teenager, the same lessons his father had taught him. Keep your hands visible. Speak calmly. Don't give anyone a reason to feel threatened. The officer took his time getting out of the patrol car. Diane watched in her side mirror as he adjusted his belt, checked something on his phone, and then finally started walking toward her. He was a big man, probably in his late 30s, with the kind of confident stride that suggested he was used to being in control of every situation he walked into. His name tag read Hendricks, and there was something about the way he carried himself that immediately put Diane on alert. She had spent her entire career reading people, assessing threats, figuring out who could be trusted and who couldn't. And something about Officer Hendricks told her this wasn't going to be a pleasant interaction. He stopped at her window and shined his flashlight directly into her face. The beam was blinding, and Diane had to resist the urge to shield her eyes. She knew that would only make things worse. "License and registration?" Hendricks said. His voice was flat, almost bored, but there was an edge to it that suggested he was looking for something. What that something was, Diane didn't know yet. "Of course, officer," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "My license is in my purse on the passenger seat, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now." She moved slowly, deliberately, making sure every motion was visible and non-threatening. It was absurd, really, having to treat a simple traffic stop like a hostage negotiation. But she had heard too many stories, seen too many headlines. To take any chances, Hendricks took the documents from her and examined them with the flashlight still pointed at her face. "Diane Crawford," he read aloud. "That your current address?" "Yes, sir." He grunted and walked back to his patrol car. Diane sat there in the darkness, her hands still on the steering wheel, and tried to figure out what this was all about. She hadn't been speeding. Her registration was up to date. Her license was valid. There was literally no reason for this stop. A few minutes passed. Then a few more. Diane could see Hendricks in her rearview mirror sitting in his car, apparently running her information through the system. She knew what he would find, which was nothing. Her record was clean. More than clean, actually. There were certain things about her service that didn't show up in any database that a local police officer would have access to. Finally, Hendricks got out of his car and walked back to her window. But something had changed. His posture was more aggressive now, his jaw set tight. Whatever he had been hoping to find, he clearly hadn't found it, and that seemed to have made him angry. "You know why I pulled you over?" he asked. Diane shook her head. "No, officer. I don't. Your taillight is out." She blinked. "I'm sorry, which one?" "I checked my vehicle this morning, and both lights were working fine." Hendricks leaned down, bringing his face closer to hers. "Are you calling me a liar?" "No, sir. I'm just saying that I checked this morning and step out of the vehicle." The words hit her like a splash of cold water. Diane had been in combat zones. She had faced situations that would give most people nightmares for the rest of their lives. But there was something uniquely unsettling about this moment, about being alone on a dark road with a man who clearly had decided she was guilty of something. "Officer, may I ask why you need me to step out?" "I said step out of the vehicle." His hand moved to rest on his belt near where his taser was holstered. "Don't make me ask again." Diane took a slow breath. She thought about the young soldiers she trained, about the lessons she tried to teach them. Stay calm under pressure. Don't let emotions drive your decisions. Assess the situation and respond appropriately. She opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder of the road. What neither of them knew was that about 50 yards behind them, another car had pulled over. The driver had noticed the traffic stop, and something about it had made her uneasy. So she had stopped, turned off her headlights, and was now watching the scene unfold through her windshield. Her name was Judge Patricia Chun, and she had spent the last 15 years presiding over federal cases in the district court. She had seen enough injustice in her courtroom to recognize when something wasn't right. And right now, every instinct she had was telling her that something was very wrong. She reached for her phone and began to record. The gravel crunched under Diane's feet as she stepped away from her car. The night air was cool, carrying the faint smell of pine trees from the woods that lined the road. Under different circumstances, it might have been peaceful. But right now, standing on the shoulder of a dark highway with Officer Hendricks looming over her, peaceful was the last thing she felt. She kept her hands visible at her sides, fingers slightly spread. It was a posture she had learned long ago, one that communicated submission without actually surrendering control. In her world, body language could mean the difference between life and death. Tonight, she hoped it would simply mean the difference between going home and ending up in the back of a patrol car. Hendricks circled around her slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. His partner, a younger officer who had stayed in the patrol car until now, finally stepped out and approached them. This one was different. Diane could see it in the way he moved, the uncertainty in his eyes. His name tag read Officer Webb, and he looked like he couldn't have been more than 25 years old. There was something almost apologetic in the way he glanced at her before turning to his partner. "Derek, what's going on?" Webb asked quietly. "What did she do?" Hendricks didn't answer right away. He was too busy shining his flashlight into Diane's car, checking the back seat, the floor, unaware he might find something to justify what he was doing. But there was nothing to find. Just an old umbrella, a gym bag, and a few folders from work that contained nothing classified. "Taillights out," Hendricks finally said. "And she's got an attitude." Diane bit her tongue. She hadn't said more than 20 words to this man, and somehow she had an attitude. It was a familiar accusation, one she had heard variations of throughout her entire life. Too confident. Too direct. Not deferential enough. The kind of complaints that were never leveled at people who didn't look like her. "Ma'am, is there anything in the vehicle I should know about?" Webb asked her. His tone was different from his partner's, more professional, more by the book. Any weapons, drugs, anything like that? No, officer, nothing. Hendricks snorted. We'll see about that. Pop the trunk. Now, Diane felt a flash of real anger, though she kept it buried deep. This was harassment, plain and simple. There was no probable cause for a search, no legal justification for any of this. But she also knew that arguing the point right now would only make things worse. So she reached into her car, pulled the lever that released the trunk, and stepped back. Hendricks walked to the rear of the vehicle and began rummaging through her trunk. Diane watched him in silence, her jaw tight. Inside that trunk was nothing but a spare tire, a first aid kit, and an old blanket she kept for emergencies. But that didn't matter to Hendricks. He tossed things aside carelessly, clearly hoping to find something, anything. That would validate the stop. While this was happening, Judge Patricia Chun sat in her car 50 yards back, her phone still recording. She had dealt with cases like this before. Officers who let their biases guide their actions. People whose lives were disrupted or destroyed because they happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Most of those cases came to her courtroom months or years after the fact, reduced to dry testimony and legal arguments. But this was happening right in front of her, in real time, and she wasn't going to look away. Her first instinct was to call 911, but she hesitated. What would she even say? That she was watching a traffic stop that seemed wrong. That wasn't a crime. The officer would claim he was just doing his job and maybe nothing would come of it. No, she decided. The best thing she could do right now was document everything. If this went sideways, there would be a record. Back at the Honda, Hendricks had finished his search of the trunk and found nothing. This seemed to make him even angrier. He slammed the trunk shut and walked back to where Diane was standing. You think you're smart, don't you? He said, getting close to her face. Driving through here in your little car, acting like you own the road. Diane met his eyes but said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that silence could be a weapon too. Sometimes the best way to defeat an aggressor was to give them nothing to work with. No reaction, no fuel for their fire. But Hendricks wasn't ready to give up. Where are you coming from tonight? I was coming from work. Work where? I work on base. Fort Bragg. Something flickered in Hendricks' expression. It might have been surprise or maybe just skepticism. You work on base? Doing what? Cleaning offices? Diane felt the insult land, but she didn't flinch. She had faced far worse than a small-minded man with a badge and a chip on his shoulder. No, officer. I'm military. Military. He said the word like he didn't believe it. What branch? Army. What do you do in the Army? This was the part where things got complicated. Diane couldn't exactly tell him the truth. Her unit didn't officially exist. Her missions were classified at levels that most people in the military didn't even know about. So she gave him the cover story, the same one she gave everyone. I'm in logistics, she said. Supply chain management. Hendricks laughed. It was an ugly sound, full of contempt. Logistics, right? So you're a paper pusher? Behind him, Officer Webb shifted uncomfortably. Derek, come on. Her record's clean. Let's just write her a warning for the taillight and let her go. I'm not done yet. Diane saw Webb's face tighten. The younger officer clearly knew this had gone too far, but he also seemed afraid to challenge his partner directly. It was a dynamic Diane recognized all too well. She had seen it in military units, in corporate offices, in every organization where one person held power and others were afraid to speak up. The bystander effect, some people called it. The tendency to stay silent when staying silent was easier than doing the right thing. Hendricks turned back to Diane. You got any ID that proves you're military? She did, actually. Her military ID was in her wallet, tucked behind her driver's license. But something told her that showing it wouldn't help. Hendricks had already made up his mind about who she was. No piece of plastic was going to change that. My military ID is in my wallet, she said. In my purse. In the car. Get it. She walked to the passenger side, retrieved her purse, and pulled out the ID. When she handed it to Hendricks, he examined it with the same skeptical expression he had worn all night. The ID showed her rank, lieutenant colonel, along with her photo and basic information. It didn't say anything about Delta Force or special operations, but it made clear that she wasn't exactly a paper pusher. For a moment, something changed in Hendricks' demeanor. A flicker of doubt, maybe even a hint of worry. But then his pride kicked back in and his expression hardened. "This doesn't prove anything," he said. "You could have gotten this anywhere." Diane stared at him. "That's an official military identification card, officer. It's issued by the Department of Defense." "I know what it is. And I'm telling you, I've seen fakes before." It was such an absurd claim that Diane almost laughed. Almost. But she held it in because laughing at a man like Hendricks would only escalate things further. In her car down the road, Judge Chin had seen enough. She put her phone down, started her engine, and began driving slowly toward the scene. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do when she got there. But she knew she couldn't just sit and watch anymore. Something bad was about to happen. She could feel it in her bones, and she was determined to stop it. The headlights of Judge Chen's car cut through the darkness as she pulled up behind the patrol vehicle. She left her engine running and her high beams on, flooding the scene with extra light. It was a deliberate choice. Whatever was about to happen, she wanted to make sure it happened where everyone could see. Hendricks spun around, squinting against the sudden brightness. His hand moved instinctively toward his hip, a reflex that sent a chill down Diane's spine. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance, the night air heavy with the possibility of something going terribly wrong. "Who the hell is that?" Hendricks muttered. Officer Webb took a step forward, shielding his eyes. "Looks like a civilian. Maybe she needs help or something." "She needs to mind her own business is what she needs." Diane watched as a woman stepped out of the car. She was in her late 50s, dressed in a simple gray coat over what looked like professional attire. There was something about the way she carried herself that commanded attention. She wasn't hurried or nervous. She walked toward them with the calm confidence of someone who was used to being in control of difficult situations. "Good evening," the woman called out as she approached. "Is everything all right here?" Hendricks turned to face her fully, his irritation obvious. "Ma'am, this is a traffic stop. I'm going to need you to get back in your vehicle and move along." The woman stopped about 10 feet away and didn't budge. "I've been watching this stop for the past 15 minutes from down the road. I have to say, officer, I'm concerned about what I've seen." Something shifted in Hendricks' expression. It was subtle, just a tightening around his eyes, but Diane caught it. He was recalculating, trying to figure out who this woman was and whether she posed a threat to whatever he had been planning. "I don't know what you think you saw," Hendricks said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "but this is official police business. Now I'm telling you one more time to get back in your car." The woman reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small leather case. She flipped it open and held it up so both officers could see. "My name is Patricia Chun. I'm a federal judge in the district court, and I've been recording this entire encounter on my phone." The silence that followed was deafening. Diane felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't even realized she was holding. She looked at Judge Chun with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. In all her years of training, all her experience in hostile environments around the world, she had never expected to be rescued on a quiet road in North Carolina by a federal judge with a cell phone. Hendricks' face had gone pale. His partner, Webb, looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Hendricks tried to recover. "Judge or not, you have no jurisdiction here. This is a local matter." Judge Chin smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're right, officer. I don't have jurisdiction over traffic stops, but I do have jurisdiction over civil rights violations. And from what I've witnessed tonight, you've conducted an illegal search, made false statements, and harassed a citizen without any lawful basis. That's not, I also couldn't help but notice that this woman showed you a military ID indicating she holds the rank of lieutenant colonel. And your response was to accuse her of having a fake ID?" Judge Chun tilted her head slightly. "Tell me, officer, Do you often accuse decorated military officers of being criminals? Hendricks opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he was standing on very thin ice. Diane decided it was time to speak up. Officer Hendricks pulled me over claiming my taillight was out. I told him I had checked my lights this morning and they were working fine. He then ordered me out of the car and searched my vehicle without my consent and without probable cause. Judge Chin nodded slowly. That matches what I observed. She turned to Officer Webb. Young man, I noticed you seemed uncomfortable with how this stop was being conducted. Would you agree that proper procedures were not followed here tonight? Webb swallowed hard. He glanced at his partner, then back at the judge. You could see the conflict playing out on his face, the struggle between loyalty to his colleague and loyalty to the truth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. The stop was... It could have been handled differently. That's not an answer. Webb took a breath. No, ma'am. Proper procedures were not followed. Hendricks turned on his partner with fury in his eyes. Are you kidding me right now? You're going to throw me under the bus for this woman. Derek, she's a federal judge, and she has everything on video. What do you want me to do? Diane watched the exchange with a strange sense of detachment. She had seen power dynamics shift like this before. In interrogation rooms and battlefield negotiations, the moment when someone realized they had lost control of the situation. Hendricks was there now. He just hadn't fully accepted it yet. Judge Chun stepped closer to Diane. Lieutenant Colonel Crawford, are you injured in any way? Did the officer make physical contact with you at any point? He grabbed my arm earlier, Diane said. When I first got out of the car, he twisted it behind my back. The judge's expression darkened. That will be in my report as well. She turned back to Hendricks. Officer, I'm going to make a phone call now. I suggest you stay exactly where you are. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Diane couldn't hear the conversation, but she could tell from the judge's tone that she was speaking to someone important, probably someone at the police department, maybe even the chief. Within moments, it was clear that things were about to change dramatically for Officer Hendricks, while Judge Chun was on the phone. Diane found herself standing next to Officer Webb. The young man looked miserable. His earlier discomfort now transformed into something closer to shame. You knew, Diane said quietly. You knew what he was doing was wrong. Why didn't you stop him sooner? Webb didn't meet her eyes. I wanted to. He's been on the force for 12 years. I've only been here for 2. Nobody listens to the new guy. People listen when you have the courage to speak up, even if you're the new guy. He nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. I know, I should have done more. I'm sorry. Diane studied him for a moment. He seemed genuine, like someone who had made a mistake and was already regretting it. She had seen a lot of people in her career, good people and bad people and everyone in between. This one, she thought, might still turn out okay. If he learned the right lessons from tonight, Judge Chen finished her call and walked back over. The precinct commander is on his way. He'll be here in about 20 minutes. She looked at Diane. I've also requested that your taillight be inspected by an independent party. I have a feeling we're going to find that it's working just fine. Diane almost smiled at that. I appreciate everything you've done tonight, Your Honor. If you hadn't stopped... I know. Judge Chun's expression softened for the first time. I've seen too many cases come through my courtroom where no one was there to witness what happened. Tonight, I could do something about it. So I did. In the distance, Diane could see more lights approaching. The cavalry was coming, and not for her. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, she allowed herself to breathe, but she also knew this wasn't over. What happened tonight was bigger than one bad traffic stop. It was a symptom of something deeper, something that had been allowed to fester for far too long, and she was determined to make sure it never happened to anyone else. The precinct commander arrived in an unmarked black SUV, followed by 2 additional patrol cars. Diane watched as a tall man in his 50s stepped out, his face tight with concern. He was dressed in civilian clothes, a polo shirt and khakis, clearly called away from his evening at home. His name was Commander Richard Torres, and from the way he surveyed the scene, it was obvious he already knew this was going to be a long night. He spoke briefly with Judge Chun first, listening intently as she described what she had witnessed. Diane couldn't hear their conversation from where she was standing, but she could see the commander's expression growing darker with every passing moment. At one point, he rubbed his hand across his face in a gesture of pure frustration. Then he turned and walked toward his officers. Hendricks had been standing by his patrol car, arms crossed, trying to maintain some appearance of authority. But that facade crumbled the moment Commander Torres stopped in front of him. "Give me your badge," Torres said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Hendricks blinked. "Sir, if you would just let me explain, your badge, Hendricks, now." For a moment, it looked like Hendricks might argue. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. But then he seemed to realize that there was no way out of this. Slowly, reluctantly, he unpinned his badge and handed it over. Torres took it without a word. Then he turned to Webb. "You're going to drive him back to the station. He's not to speak to anyone until Internal Affairs arrives." "Understood?" Webb nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." As Hendricks was led to the patrol car, he shot one last look at Diane. There was anger in his eyes, but also something else. Fear, maybe. Or the dawning realization that his career, his reputation, everything he had built over 12 years, was about to come crashing down. Diane felt no satisfaction watching him go. She was too tired for that, too drained by the events of the evening. All she wanted now was to go home and put this night behind her. Commander Torres approached her next. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of responsibility that came with his position. This wasn't just a bad night for her. It was a bad night for everyone involved. "Lieutenant Colonel Crawford," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Commander Torres. I cannot begin to tell you how sorry I am for what happened here tonight." Diane shook his hand. "Thank you, Commander. I appreciate you coming out personally. It's the least I could do." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Judge Chen has shared the video with me. I've also reviewed Officer Hendricks' body camera footage on my way here. What I saw was completely unacceptable. There will be a full investigation, and I promise you that appropriate action will be taken." Diane nodded slowly. She had heard promises like this before, from people in positions of power who meant well but couldn't always deliver. Still, there was something in Torres' voice that made her want to believe him. "Can I ask you something, Commander?" "Of course." "How many complaints have been filed against Officer Hendricks before tonight?" Torres hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely noticeable, but Diane caught it. She had spent her career reading people, picking up on the tiny signals that revealed what they were really thinking. And right now, Commander Torres was wrestling with whether to tell her the truth. "There have been some complaints," he finally admitted. "I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but more than a few." He met her eyes. "Yes, more than a few." Diane let that sink in. She wasn't surprised, not really. Men like Hendricks didn't wake up one morning and decide to harass people. It was a pattern, a behavior that developed over time, enabled by a system that looked the other way. The question was how many other people had been pulled over on dark roads, subjected to the same treatment, and sent on their way with no one to witness what happened. "I understand there may be limits to what you can share," Diane said. "But I want you to know that I'm not going to let this go. What happened tonight wasn't just about me. It was about everyone else who came before me and didn't have a federal judge watching from down the road." Torres nodded gravely. "I understand. And for what it's worth, I agree with you." Judge Chen joined them, her phone still in her hand. "I've been in contact with the district attorney's office. They're very interested in this case, especially given Officer Hendricks' history." "His history?" Diane turned to her. "You found something?" "I made a few calls while we were waiting for the commander to arrive. It seems Officer Hendricks has been the subject of 17 formal complaints over the past 8 years. Excessive force, verbal abuse, illegal searches. The patterns are remarkably consistent." She paused. and remarkably familiar. 17 complaints. The number hit Diane like a punch to the stomach. 17 people who had gone through what she went through tonight, maybe worse. 17 chances for the system to do something, and 17 times it had failed. How is that possible? Diane asked, though she already knew the answer. How does someone rack up 17 complaints and still have a badge? Torres looked down at the ground. Internal investigations. Union protections. Witnesses who were reluctant to come forward. A lot of these complaints, they get filed and then nothing happens. The officer gets a warning, maybe some additional training, and then they're back on the street. Until someone ends up hurt, Diane said. Or worse. Yes. Torres met her eyes again. Until that. The three of them stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on all of them. Diane thought about her soldiers, the men and women she had led into some of the most dangerous places on earth. She thought about the responsibility she felt for each of them, the knowledge that their lives depended on her decisions. And she thought about the people in this community, ordinary citizens who had to trust that the officers patrolling their streets would protect them, not prey on them, that trust had been broken. And rebuilding it was going to take more than one investigation, one termination, one case. What happens now? Diane asked. Judge Chen answered. Now we build a case. I'll be coordinating with the district attorney to review all of Officer Hendrick's previous complaints. If there's a pattern of civil rights violations, and I'm confident there is, he won't just lose his job. He'll face criminal charges? And the department? Diane looked at Torres. What about the people who let this go on for 8 years? Torres didn't flinch from the question. If there are failures in our internal processes, we'll address them. I can't promise it will happen overnight. These things take time. But I can promise you that I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure this never happens again. Diane studied him for a long moment. He seemed sincere, but sincerity wasn't enough. Action was what mattered, results. I'm going to hold you to that, Commander, she said. And I'm not going to be the only one watching. She looked at Judge Chun, who nodded in agreement. Whatever happened next, they were in this together. A military officer, a federal judge, and a police commander, all brought together by a traffic stop on a dark road in North Carolina. It wasn't the team Diane would have expected. But maybe it was exactly the team that was needed. The investigation was just beginning. And this time, the truth wasn't going to be buried. 3 months had passed since that night on the side of the road. 3 months of investigations, depositions, and meetings that seemed to stretch on forever. Diane had given her testimony more times than she could count, repeating the same story to internal affairs investigators, district attorneys, and eventually, a congressional subcommittee on police reform. She had never wanted any of this. Her entire career had been built on staying invisible, doing her job in the shadows where no one would ever know her name. But sometimes life had other plans. Sometimes the spotlight found you whether you wanted it or not. The hearing room in Washington was smaller than she had expected. She had imagined something grand with marble columns and high ceilings. Instead, it was a functional space, all beige walls and fluorescent lighting, filled with rows of chairs and a long table where the committee members sat with their microphones and nameplates. Cameras lined the back of the room, and reporters filled the press section, their notepads ready. Diane sat at the witness table, a glass of water in front of her that she hadn't touched. She was wearing her dress uniform today, something she rarely did outside of official military functions. But this moment called for it. She wanted the people watching to understand exactly who she was and what she represented. The committee chairman, an older man with gray hair and tired eyes, leaned into his microphone. Lieutenant Colonel Crawford, thank you for being here today. We've read your written testimony and reviewed the evidence submitted by Judge Chun and the District Attorney's Office. Before we proceed with questions, is there anything you'd like to say to the committee? Diane took a breath. She had prepared remarks, carefully written statements that had been reviewed by lawyers and public affairs officers. But sitting here now, looking at the faces of the people who had the power to change things, she decided to speak from the heart instead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, she began. I want to start by saying that what happened to me 3 months ago was not unique. It wasn't special. It wasn't rare. The only thing that made my case different was that a federal judge happened to be driving by at the right moment. Without her, without that video on her phone, I would have been just another complaint in a filing cabinet. Another name on a list that nobody ever looked at. She paused, letting her words settle over the room. Officer Hendricks had 17 complaints against him. Before he pulled me over that night, 17, that's 17 people who tried to tell someone that something was wrong. 17 people who trusted the system to protect them and were let down. I was lucky. Most of them weren't. The room was silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing. I've spent my entire adult life serving this country, Diane continued. I've led soldiers into situations that most people can't even imagine. I've seen the best of what humanity has to offer, and I've seen the worst. And I can tell you that the problem we're talking about today isn't about one bad officer. It's about a system that allows bad officers to keep doing harm year after year, while good officers stay silent because they're afraid of the consequences. She thought of Officer Webb, the young man who had stood by while his partner crossed every line. He had come forward during the investigation, providing testimony that helped build the case against Hendricks. It had cost him friendships on the force, made him an outsider among some of his colleagues. But he had done the right thing, even when it was hard. That gave Diane hope. I'm not here to condemn all police officers, she said. I know that most of them are good people doing a difficult job. But goodness isn't enough if it stays silent. Courage means speaking up when you see something wrong, even if it costs you. That's what we teach our soldiers. That's what we should expect from everyone who wears a uniform and carries a badge. The questions that followed were probing but respectful. The committee members asked about the details of the stop, about the investigation, about what reforms she thought were necessary. Diane answered each one as honestly as she could, drawing on her experience as a leader, as a soldier, and as a citizen who had seen the system fail. By the time the hearing ended, she was exhausted. But she also felt something she hadn't expected. A sense of purpose that went beyond her military service, beyond the classified missions and the shadowy world she had inhabited for so long. For the first time in her career, she had stepped into the light. And maybe, just maybe, it would make a difference. The weeks that followed brought changes, some small and some significant. Officer Hendricks was convicted on multiple charges, including civil rights violations and filing false reports. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, a punishment that sent a clear message to officers across the country. His case became a symbol, a turning point that showed there would be consequences for abuse of power. Commander Torres followed through on his promise. The department implemented new oversight procedures, mandatory body camera reviews, and an early warning system to flag officers with patterns of complaints. It wasn't a perfect solution, and there was still a long way to go. But it was a start. Judge Chun worked with lawmakers to draft legislation, requiring independent review boards for police misconduct cases. The bill faced opposition, as all meaningful reforms do, but it gained momentum as more stories came to light. Other victims of Officer Hendricks came forward, sharing their experiences publicly for the first time. Their voices added weight to the push for change. As for Diane, she returned to her duties at Fort Bragg. The spotlight faded, as it always does, and she went back to the work she had devoted her life to. But something had shifted inside her. She started mentoring young soldiers differently, emphasizing not just tactical skills, but moral courage. The willingness to stand up for what's right, even when the cost is high. One evening, about 6 months after the congressional hearing, Diane came home to find a letter waiting in her mailbox. It was handwritten, sent from an address she didn't recognize in a small town in Georgia. She opened it carefully, not sure what to expect. The letter was from a young woman named Letitia. She wrote that she had watched Diane's testimony on television and that it had changed something in her. For years, she had been afraid to speak up about an encounter with a police officer that had left her shaken and humiliated. She had convinced herself that nobody would believe her, that nothing would change even if she tried. But watching Diane, Hearing her words had given her the courage to finally file a complaint. And not just a complaint. She had connected with a civil rights organization and was now working to help others in her community do the same. "I don't know if you'll ever read this," the letter said, "but I wanted you to know that you made a difference. Not just for yourself, but for people like me who never thought anyone was listening. Thank you for standing your ground. Thank you for being brave." Diane read the letter 3 times, sitting alone in her kitchen as the sun set outside her window. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer where she kept the things that mattered most. Not medals or commendations, but small reminders of why she did what she did. She had spent her whole life protecting people from threats they would never see. But this, she realized, was a different kind of service. This was about standing in the light so that others could find their way out of the darkness, and that, she thought, was worth more than any classified mission or secret honor. It was worth everything.